Welcome to our podcast, I Never Lied, the Shelly Ann story. I will speak openly and honestly without fear of judgment or retaliation. I live in the city of Lloydminster. These are the famous border markers that separate the province of Saskatchewan and province of Alberta. You have to choose which province you want to live in. It is one or the other. To me, and in relation to this podcast, these border markers represent the idea that when it comes to childhood trauma and abuse, you must pick a side. On one side, you can choose to remain silent, believe this is a taboo subject, and not get involved. Or you can step on the other side and reach out to others, either to help or to get help. Just like the border markers, this is one area that you cannot live on the fence. If you try to, you will eventually fall off. In this series of podcasts, I'm hoping to educate, inform, and inspire you to stand up against childhood trauma and abuse. And if you are a victim, I want you to know that you're not alone. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of I Never Lied, the Shelly Ann story. Hi, I'm Shelly Ann. Yes, I am a woman in mourning, and I'm mourning for the little baby girl who stood no chance of happiness. Most people start out as a glimmer of hope in the eyes of their awaiting parents. However, I was the devastating reality of a child unwanted. I was the intended abortion who survived. A smart woman once told me that I had a very strong soul. She said that God would never give me more than I could handle. And I remember thinking, you're nuts, lady. I might seem strong, but inside I'm a frail and weak giant melting pot of emotion just waiting to explode. For as far back as I can remember, I've been hurt easily, and I've taken everything to heart. I've held on to pain like it was a best friend, and I knew there was no magical cure, that it would always be with me. I could count on it to never leave. And as hard as it is to understand or explain, pain had defined my very existence, and it had become a comforting companion. This sounds stupid, I know, but for my entire life, pain was the only constant thing I knew. It was deep, it was real, and it was mine. My mother already had 3 children when she found out she was pregnant with me. One day, my father came home and announced he was leaving, and he wanted a divorce. He had met another woman, and this other woman was also pregnant. My mother asked her doctor for an abortion, but he refused because it was too late. So she went home and took a bunch of medication to abort me on her own. Thankfully, this didn't work. But I was born early, and I spent nearly 6 months in the hospital. I've been told over the years that my mother would go to the hospital and watch through the nursery window while I was being cared for by the nurses. She never came in, she never held me, and we definitely did not bond. Her intention was to just leave me there, but my grandfather wouldn't have it. He said if she took me home, he'd pay for all costs, food, clothes, diapers, pretty much everything else, and she agreed. My stepfather joined the family soon after my birth, and within 2.5 years another child was born. He had a very wicked temper, and he was actually in prison for stabbing a man in a bar when this child was born. There are many words that I could use to describe our home, but I think disarray is the best suited. In the dictionary, disarray is defined as confusion, dismay, panic, alarm, hysteria, and frenzy. And each of these descriptors remind me of my childhood home. We were the typical description of common white trailer trash. Both my mother and stepfather had major drinking problems, which were masked by denial. And this meant that our home was ruled by alcoholism, anger, and a total lack of love. Violent, drunken outbursts between my parents were common and all too familiar. My mother possessed the insane ability to push my stepfather's buttons at just the right moment to cause an eruption. They would hit each other and scream and yell until one of them finally left the house or went to bed. Our home was trashed many times by my parents. A drunken escapade sometimes meant that everything we owned got smashed and broken. Mattresses were slashed with butcher knives, clothing shredded, and even pictures were shot at with pellet gun. And each of these events were followed by the unforgettable promise that one day my stepfather would kill us. I never wondered or questioned if he would kill us. I just wondered, when would he do it? My stepfather had affairs, he made death threats, and yet my mother stayed with him. Her reasoning was at least you have a roof over your head, clothes on your back, and food in your bellies. Our family was constantly on the move. From the time I was born until I was 12 years old, we moved to a new city or returned to a city where we had lived before. And we moved about every 6 months. Our possessions were kept to a minimum in order to move quickly. Usually it was our toys that were left behind. A minimum load made for a quicker departure. Each time my parents relocated us, it was supposedly for my stepfather to work. But sometimes it was because they had had a drunken fight and were embarrassed, and sometimes it was because they just couldn't pay the bills. To my parents, running away seemed to be the best option. The moves were usually planned and organized, but sometimes they took place in the middle of the night. The main thing that I learned was that no matter where we weren't going to be there for long. So it was important to not get close to anyone, so it wouldn't hurt you when you suddenly had to leave. Deep down inside me, I think I always knew that my mother didn't love me, and nor did she want me. More often than not, her true feelings came out in the way she looked at me, and her actions towards me spoke volumes. She called me terrible names. I was tagged as stupid, useless, and was a targeted punchline of her many cruel jokes. My mother enjoyed making me look stupid in front of other people, and I can only assume that my failures made her look and feel better about herself. Mother used humiliation to help shape the insecure person I became. And when I talk about physical punishment from my mother, I actually mean corporal punishment. Because when she was mad, she didn't just slap you. No, it was much worse than that. My mother snapped. She would completely lose her mind. She got so angry at times that she would just grab whatever item was the closest to her and hit you with it. Including a time when she whipped us with the track off of a Hot Wheels racetrack set. And I remember her being angry with me because I never played with that game again. If someone told Mother that I lied about something or stole something or I had done something wrong, it became her truth. No matter what I said or what the truth really was, Mother's motto was punish her first and maybe get the details later. My stepfather was aware of Mother's feelings towards me, and he was a witness to the many physical punishments I received because of her anger. And sometimes he did his best to protect me, but more often than not, he just stood by and let her do whatever she wanted. He had to, I guess. After all, he could be just as humiliating at times, especially if we weren't following his rules. When we ate our meals, his rule was for us to sit with our back straight up against a chair, have both feet planted on the floor. There was to be no noise, no music, no TV to be heard in the background. As a small example of his cruelty, one morning, now I didn't think he was home. So one morning when I was eating breakfast, I broke all the rules. I sat in my chair leaning slightly forward, had my right foot tucked up underneath my left knee, and I was listening to the radio. Suddenly he burst into the kitchen and grabbed me by the back of my neck. He threw my bowl of cereal on the floor, twisted my arm behind my back, and pushed me down on my knees, shoving my face into the bowl. He screamed at me, "If you want to eat like a pig, then you might as well be a pig." I was only 12 years old when my stepfather made a decision that would change my life forever. My innocence stolen, my childhood abandoned, my soul crushed and destroyed. The first time he sexually assaulted me, he said if I told anyone, he would kill me. Our family history, along with his recent 3-month stay in the Saskatchewan Mental Hospital for violence, made me believe his threat. After the second assault, he said, "You should have told. Now it's your fault." I was way too young to understand the meaning of what was happening, but it was still too much to handle. I didn't understand how he could do this to me, and the worst part was that I didn't trust my mother enough to tell her. Threatening to tell him and even begging him to stop was not enough to convince him. It was with a sick and demented mind that he began to believe that I wanted it, that I enjoyed it. How could he have confused my terror with pleasure? How could he possibly misread ultimate fear with wanting it? With each sexual assault, my stepfather became more sadistic and the acts more degrading. He was vicious and brutal. He chose from an arsenal of weaponry, including knives and a screwdriver. Once he threatened to bash my head in with a hammer if I didn't do what he wanted me to do. He burned my breast with a cigarette and told me that for the rest of my life, every time I look at those scars, I have to think of him. The worse the assault, the more he seemed to revel in my fear. I eventually created a safe place in my mind, a place where no one could hurt me, a place where my mind could escape to, a place that provided relief from the physical and mental anguish he was causing. At the age of 14, when I could no longer bear what was happening, I decided to end my life. I thought that my stepfather would one day keep his promise and kill me, so I thought if I killed myself, it would be on my own terms, painless and peaceful. After taking a bunch of pills, I went to bed. I was happy, knowing that it was finally going to be over. So you can only imagine the shock of waking up in the hospital with my mother, a social worker, and my stepfather standing over my bed. My mother was arguing with the social worker, insisting that I hadn't tried to commit suicide. She was positive I just wanted to make myself sick. I mean, after all, according to her, I was only looking for sympathy. My stepfather stood quietly until my mother and the worker left the room. Then he leaned over my bed and whispered, "Nice try. I know what you were doing. If your life means nothing to you, then maybe the lives of your brother and sisters do. Maybe I'll have to kill them and make you watch." All I could do was cry. I was such a loser. I couldn't do anything right, not even kill myself. It wasn't long after my release from the hospital that social workers decided I needed to see a psychiatrist at the old Saskatchewan Mental Hospital. I saw a psychiatrist for a while, until one day he said, "I know what's happening, but I can't do anything if you don't tell me." I didn't know what else to do, so I told him. I told him everything. And at the end of that meeting, he said, "I want you to know that I believe you, and I'm going to help you." At that time, I also told him about what happened to my sister and to a friend of mine. Right away, he called my mother and the social worker and told them what I had told him. From there, it was like a whirlwind. They picked up my sister and we went to the social services office. Then the police station, statements were taken, and it seemed as though someone was finally going to help me. But within a couple of weeks and being sent out of town and then being brought back home, I found out that my sister had been sent away to stay with our real father, and no one had ever talked to my friend. And then it happened. A few days after I returned home at about 6 in the morning, my mother came to my room to wake me up. She told me to get dressed and come upstairs. As I rounded the corner at the top of the stairs, I noticed the same social worker sitting at the table drinking coffee. My mother was busy packing my suitcase. Mother pointed to the couch and told me to sit down. She started out by saying that she didn't believe the accusations I made against my stepfather. Then she said that I had lied to her so many times that she just didn't know what she could believe. She took a moment to catch her breath, and then she said it. She said, "I want to talk about why we don't love each other." And there it was, like a smack in the face. She finally said it. She really did not love me. I was stunned by her admittance and the fact that the social worker didn't even flinch. So then she proceeded to tell me that she was pregnant with me during her divorce and she tried to have an abortion. She said, "You were in the hospital for probably 6 months after you were born, and that's why we never bonded. That's why we don't love each other." Honestly, I feel like I'm being forced to choose. I mean, you'll grow up and leave home anyways, so I have to choose your stepfather. Her facial expression said it all. There were no feelings of regret glittering in her eyes. She was an empty and emotionless shell of a woman who acted as though the greatest burden had just been lifted off of her shoulders. The truth was out, and no matter what the consequences to me or my life, at least she felt better. Deep-rooted within me, I knew the reality was that I had been a burden to her since the day I was born. I seemed to be some kind of sick reminder of the man who ran from her into the arms of another woman. I had become a living tribute to the man who did not honor her enough to respect the vows he made to her. I was like a living souvenir of his lies, adultery, and ultimate betrayal. And each time she looked at me, she saw him and his infidelities, and I, like him, disgusted her. Her hurtful words etched themselves into my brain and molded my soul, slowly dimming the lights of what spirit I had left. Mother closed the suitcase and directed me to the back door, and the social worker told me to get in her car. I sat in the back seat while Mother and the social worker sat in the front. Once the three of us were driving on the highway, the social worker began her speech. I've taken a serious look at all the information, and the only conclusion I can come to is that you were lying about everything. She took a quick glance in the rearview mirror to see my reaction before continuing. I had a meeting with the psychiatrist, and unfortunately for you, he doesn't believe you either. She hesitated for a moment, looking back at my mother, and then continued. What you've done to your stepfather is not fair. He really has no defense against your lies. I looked at my mother and said, "Where are we going?" Mother swiveled around in her seat, looking me square in the eyes. "Kilburn Hall in Saskatoon," she said, smiling slightly. "What's that?" "It's a lockup. It's a prison for underage criminals." It blurted out of her mouth so fast that I almost missed what Mother was saying. In a state of shock, I thought back to those all too familiar words. The first time my stepfather touched me, he said, "If you tell, I'm going to kill you." And the second time he said, "You should have told. Now it's your fault. Go ahead. No one will believe you. And it doesn't matter. It's just you." And he was right. I can't even begin to describe the feelings that engulfed me as I entered Kilburn Hall on August 4th, 1978. It was only a few weeks before my 15th birthday, but I was pretty sure I wasn't there for the party. The halls were cold and sterile. The floors glistened like they had purposely been overwaxed. Faint voices in the background were being stifled by the jingling of the guards' keys that bounced off his hips as we walked down the corridor. The sounds of distant laughter made me feel like I had entered the halls of a haunted building. At the end of a long hallway, I was instructed to have a seat outside of an office. My mother and the social worker went inside the office and closed the glass door, leaving the guard to watch over me. They spoke with a woman that appeared to be about the same age as my mother. The woman repeatedly bent her head forward and peered at me with disapproving eyes over top of her glasses. I could only imagine what was being said about me. Finally, the woman picked up her phone, spoke a few words before hanging up again. Within minutes, although it seemed like an hour, a female guard came around the corner. She picked up my suitcase and told me to follow her down another hallway and directed me into a room. She plunked my suitcase down onto a table and proceeded to empty it out, checking each item of clothing. I wasn't really sure what she was looking for. She handed me a piece of paper with a list of rules on it and told me to read it along with her. But I couldn't. I was so upset and so confused that the words made no sense to me at all. We left that room, and she directed me further down the hallway to some stairs. At the bottom of those stairs there stood a massive steel door. As I followed her down to the door, she pulled a huge skeleton key from her pocket, which was used to unlock it. You can only imagine my horror as this female guard, a complete stranger, led me into a shower area and instructed me to get undressed. The entire process of being strip searched by this woman was like being raped all over again. She showed no emotion and certainly had no concern for my emotional well-being. Once the invasion of my body was complete, I was instructed to have a shower before being taken to a cell. The guard referred to my cell as the D room. The D stood for detention. The room was small, and the door had a tiny window in it. There was a window in the wall to the outside world, but the glass was so thick you couldn't see through it. In the corner stood a metal toilet and matching sink, which were both hidden behind a half-wall divider. I was provided the bare essentials: a single metal framed bed that was bolted to the floor, a rubber-covered mattress, a set of starched sheets, and an itchy army blanket, and a flat and overused pillow. Before the guard left the room, she informed me that it was standard practice for all new detainees to spend their first couple of weeks in that room. I was banned from speaking to anyone or being spoken to. If I chose to break the rules, my stay in the D room would be extended. Once the guard left, I went over and sat on the bed. I was in a complete state of shock. How could this be happening? I didn't do anything wrong. Or did I? I was so confused, I just didn't know, and I cried until I had no tears left. I met with counselors twice a week, and the impression I got was they thought that they could make me into a better person. They told me that it had been made clear to them that I was a liar, and they had the tools to help me admit it. They said that I had to stay in Kilburn Hall until I decided to finally tell the truth, until I decided to admit that my stepfather had never hurt me. And isn't it ironic that I was denied the right to discuss the fact that I was not the only child who made claims against my stepfather? So why was the only child locked up? These people weren't here to hear the truth. They didn't want to know about how us kids were made to live our lives. They weren't interested in hearing about the alcohol and the violence in our home. They weren't interested in hearing about the name-calling, the beatings, or the bullying. No, these counselors had already made up their minds. I never said much during our sessions. I mainly listened for as long as I could before switching off. My only recourse was to give up and say nothing at all. I couldn't tell them what they wanted to hear because that would have been a lie. So I simply decided to do my time, and eventually they'd have to let me go. I will admit that my 6-month stay in Kilburn Hall was not a total waste of time. I did manage to learn several valuable lessons, which I carried with me for many years after I left that place. I learned to suppress my feelings and to never let anyone see the pain. I learned never to discuss my issues of abuse with anyone because I was guilty. But the biggest lesson of all was that it didn't matter because it was just me. I was released from Kilburn Hall on January 15, 1979 and placed into a foster home for unwed mothers in North Battleford. Yes, a home for unwed mothers when I was not, nor had I ever been pregnant. Can you imagine that I was now living only 3 miles away from my mother and stepfather? My foster parents were probably the kindest and most loving people that I ever met in my life, and I might even have stood a chance at happiness by living my life with these people, but of course it wasn't meant to be. I realized this the first time my mother popped in for coffee. Her intentions were to cause problems. My mother visited frequently, and each time became more destructive as she targeted me, lied about me, and over-exaggerated my past. She worked vigorously to convince my foster mother that I was a liar and I could not be trusted under any circumstance. I had no defense against my mother's words. She was attempting to turn my foster mother against me, and there was nothing I could do about it. So I started acting out in retaliation. Finally, the social worker came and gave me a choice. She said I could either stay and put up with my mother and make it work, or I could get out. If I stayed, social services would continue to try and help me, but if I left, I would be on my own. With my decision made, I took my solitary suitcase and headed out on my own. In the beginning, life was exciting. I stayed with friends and I partied a lot. I was footloose and fancy-free, as they say. I didn't have a care in the world. I managed to get small jobs here and there. But when you're only 15, it's not easy to get a job, and it's not easy to keep it. Most of the money I earned was spent on alcohol, and I never seemed to worry about tomorrow. I was enjoying my life and living in the moment. The funny thing is that when you take and take from friends without returning anything, they eventually tell you to take a hike. And trust me, it wasn't long before I had burned all of my bridges and found myself homeless and alone. With nowhere to go and no money in hand, I was left with little choices. I decided to move into the churchyard just off Main Street in North Battleford. With no access to a shower and nowhere to do laundry, I soon started to look like a mess. I couldn't get any more jobs, and no work meant no money. No money meant no food. After some time of living alone in the churchyard, I knew I couldn't keep living this way. So I decided to go to my older sister and ask for help. My sister seemed nervous and a little taken aback when she opened the door and saw me standing there. I asked her to help me. Before she could say a word, my brother pushed past her and came out of the door. Within seconds, he started beating on me, all the while screaming that he hated me and he wished I was dead. And with one final push, he threw me down onto the road. He shoved my sister into the house and slammed the door. I went back to the churchyard devastated and weighed out what my options could be. I knew there was only one. Now, prostitution is a dirty word for most of us, but when you have nothing else, what can you do? I stood 5 foot 4 inches and weighed in at about 115 pounds. My figure was tiny and tight, with curves that fell into all the right places. And let's be honest, my life experience at this point had taught me that I was going to be good for one thing and one thing only. So I thought, why not at the very least get paid for it? And that's when I made the decision to hitchhike to Saskatoon. A group of 6 bikers from a notoriously rough club drove past. One of the men, who I later learned his name was Big Red, pulled over. He took a long, hard look at me before he spoke. "Where are you headed?" I told him that I was going to Saskatoon and that I had a job waiting for me. I know he had to have noticed my black eye, and that it was almost swollen shut, and the huge crack in my lip impairing my speech, but he never said anything. "Okay," he said, handing me a spare helmet. "Get on." Big Red took me to their clubhouse. I was intimidated for sure, as I had never seen anything like it before. The clubhouse was huge, and it sat in the middle of a yard surrounded by 8-foot-high chain-link fences. There were several dogs on the property, and most of them were Rottweilers. These vicious-looking animals wore heavy leather claws with spikes on it, and were bolted to dog houses by thick chains. In the few months that I lived in this house, I was taken care of. I was provided for, and I was kept safe. And isn't it funny that I felt safer with these people than I ever did in my own home? I'll never forget, as I was approaching my 16th birthday, and Big Red took me for a ride. He explained that since I was no longer going to be a minor in their eyes, I would have to make a financial contribution to the clubhouse, just like everyone else. He said that if I chose to stay, I would have to go out and earn. He said, "Now's the time to get out." He put his hand in his pocket and gave me a couple of $100 to help me get started. He hugged me and said, "You're going to be okay, kid." I didn't know where else to go, so I actually headed back to North Battleford, as this was familiar territory for me. I made arrangements to stay with a friend, and I used the money that Big Red gave me to pay rent. I avoided my family, including my siblings, and I got a job at a small restaurant and started over. Life was never boring, and there was always something to do. I shared that apartment with Kim, and life became much more affordable. I partied nearly every night, and drinking until I passed out became my norm. I never liked drinking, but it enabled me to forget about my past. The more I drank, the less I had to think. Drinking and partying cost me my apartment with Kim. Her name was on the lease, and when she had had enough, she told me to get out. I started hanging around with another crowd of people, drinking and partying until eventually I got in trouble by breaking the law. the judge decided to cut me a break. Instead of locking me up with my friends, he said he was going to give me one chance. This one chance was 1 year probation. I returned that day to the churchyard that I had stayed in the year before. Now, as I sat on the bench, I thought back to my last conversation with my friend Big Red and the words of wisdom that he shared with me. You are the creator of your own destiny. You own all of the control over what you do and where you go in life. Live your life wisely. I never really thought about what he was trying to say to me, but now I totally understood the meaning behind his words. If I stayed and continued on this path of fighting, drinking, and destruction, I was surely going to go to jail next. With $13 in my pocket and permission from my probation officer, I went to the Greyhound bus depot and I bought a ticket, which took me to Wainwright, Alberta. With the help of a man that I met there, I got my first job washing dishes for the military. Now, this job paid very well, and by the time I got my second paycheck, I managed to get a place of my own, and life was good. I had a great job. I had an apartment, and I had a ton of new friends. I had food on my table and clothes on my back. It was awesome. When I turned 17, I told everyone it was my 18th birthday. No one questioned it, not even when I went to the bar. None of the bartenders seemed to care about my real age because no one thought to ask for my ID. I celebrated and had a great time. My shift at the military base worked on a rotating schedule of 10 days on and 4 days off. I did drink every night, but on my days off, my friends and I partied. We bar hopped and danced until we dropped. There were no limits and no rules, and no one seemed interested in stopping us from what we were doing. I rarely spent money on alcohol, as there were plenty of men around to buy my drinks all night, every night. My greatest relief was that no one in Wainwright knew about my past. No one knew that only a year and a half before I had aspired to become a prostitute, because I didn't believe I could ever do anything else. Not one soul, besides one friend, knew that I had been in Kilburn Hall, and I was positive he was never going to gossip about me. I knew he did not possess a true and total picture of the disgusting life I had lived as a child, because I didn't tell him everything. What more could I have asked for? With cash in my pocket and free access to the bars, I continued my journey towards alcoholism. I consumed enormous amounts of whiskey and beer every day. The constant partying was fun, but eventually the effects of the booze took hold and began to control my life completely. 1 drink became 3, 3 became 10, and so on. I can't say I even enjoyed it, but it was the greatest forget-about-it tool ever invented. When I was drunk, I was able to escape the realities of my past and all the negative feelings I had towards myself. When I was sober, I was a nobody, but when I was drunk, I was a somebody. Alcohol became my guts, my backbone, and under the influence of it, I stood 7 feet tall. No one could hurt me because I was more likely to hurt them first. I was an angry young woman, and that anger showed its ugly head every time I put that bottle to my lips. 1 sip past the point of no return, and I became a mean and nasty person. My temper was so out of control that I would have picked a fight with a telephone pole, believing that it might kick my butt, but I'll give it a good fight on the way down. My mother's words had branded themselves into my brain, and I knew I would never amount to anything without a man in my life. And I truly believe that's why I exposed myself to harmful, abusive relationships over and over again. My relationships with men took place behind the blinders of whiskey and beer. What I did when I was drunk would never have happened when I was sober. I was battered and bruised, but always looked for the next man of my life before I walked away from the one I was with. If I was cheated on, I knew it was because I wasn't good enough. And when I was beaten, I understood it was because I was stupid and I probably deserved it. A few days before my 18th birthday, the news of Clifford Olson's capture became the main focus of newscasts around the country. Clifford Olson had raped, tortured, and murdered 11 children and was now being held accountable for his crimes. The country couldn't quit talking about these horrific events. Even I couldn't escape the intense chatter and speculation discussed amongst my friends. The entire country cried for these poor innocent victims, for the fear and the pain they surely must have felt before they died. And I cried too, but my tears were out of jealousy. I cried because these children got to die. I cried because no one would ever accuse them of lying. No one would ever tell them it was their fault. I cried because they would not have to live the rest of their lives with the memories of the cruelties of this evil and twisted man had bestowed upon them. I cried because they would never have to live their lives in a world where everyone turned their backs on them. I cried because I had to live. And before I knew it, my old friend depression kicked in again, and the old thoughts of suicide took hold of my brain. Alcohol began tasting sweeter, and drinking myself into oblivion was my only route to survival. With the old thoughts of suicide creeping back in, so did the memory of my first failed attempt. I think I was more afraid of failing again and hurting myself and being forced to live with the consequences. My whole life, I just wanted to be loved. I wanted my mother to love me. I wanted her to accept me, and I wanted her approval. But no matter what I did, I was never going to get it. I remember her saying things to me like I was stupid and I was ugly and that I better learn how to cook because that's the only way I was ever going to get a man. Part of me knew she was lying, but part of me believed it was true. When I was 17, I met a man and I fell head over heels in love with him. But I became pregnant and we ended up breaking up. It's a really long story, but I think we both had abusive childhoods and we just couldn't make it work. And sadly, he passed away when my son was 3. So there should be no surprise when I tell you that by the age of 27, I had been married and divorced twice and was well into my 3rd. I'm proud to say that Ron and I have been together for 32 years. Now, in the beginning of our relationship, we both drank a lot, and I was still a scrapper. So this meant we fought a lot. But in 1994, I finally decided enough was enough, and I stopped drinking. And Ron quickly followed suit. I have to admit that I kept most of the information about my childhood to myself and did not tell Ron for a long time. Then one day, just when things were going beautiful, my stepfather walked into our house, threw a Bible at me, and announced that he had found God. He got down on his knee in front of Ron and asked for me to please forgive him for what he had done to me when I was a child. This action of his raised the hair on the back of my neck because I knew he wasn't there for me. I knew he wanted access to my kids. Deep in my heart, I knew that if I went to the police, I was probably going to go back to jail. Because let's not forget, the first time I told that's exactly what happened to me. But I knew that would be the only way to save my children from him. And if I had to go to jail, I would. But don't misunderstand me. I had a plan the night I went to the police station. I had seen a lawyer and had all the paperwork done to give Ron custody of my children. I did this to protect them from my family. I knew that there would be one of 3 outcomes of my going to the police about my stepfather. The first would be they would believe me, but that I would end up going back to jail. Because don't forget, it had been ingrained in me that I was guilty for what he had done to me. The second outcome would be that they would charge him and not me. But the third outcome that night was that if they didn't believe me, I was going to commit suicide, because I wouldn't be able to stand around and watch him hurt anyone else. I have to tell you now that I believe that the grace of God was shining on me, because the police officer who listened to my story believed it. He was actually shocked that when I began the conversation, I said, I know I'm probably going to go to jail, but I have to report a rape. He asked me who the victim was, and I said me. And then he asked who had assaulted me. And I told him it was my stepfather. He looked at me and said, I don't think this happened recently, did it? And I said no. He asked me why I was there now, and I said to protect my children. He invited me into the back office, and we sat and talked, and I cried a lot, and I talked so much to him. He took his notes, he paid great attention to what I was saying, and his compassion was unbelievable. He sat there and told me that none of this had been my fault. I saw a single tear in his eye, and for the first time I started to believe I was just a victim. The entire process of going through the motions to have my stepfather charged were long and grueling. It absolutely was one of the hardest things I ever had to go through. Now, I have to remind you that this is a man who told me for the most of my childhood that he would kill me if I ever told anyone. I was scared for my life. I knew I couldn't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder waiting for him to hurt me. So I very quickly made the decision to put our house up for sale, pack all of our stuff, and get out of Dodge. During this time, we moved several times, and I guess I was just trying to stay one step ahead of him. When we finally went to pretrial, the courts provided us with an armed police officer. I testified, Ron testified, my sister testified, and my friend testified. It was on that day at court when I finally learned the truth. When I had originally told on my stepfather, no one, not the police nor the social workers, ever approached her or her parents. At the end of the pretrial, the judge decided that there was enough evidence to go to trial. And as they were creating the list of witnesses, it was made clear that my brother had agreed to testify against our stepfather. I'll never forget that day in court. My stepfather had slumped down into his chair, and his lawyer had turned his back on him. Now you have to remember that we were still on the run after the pretrial. And even though people said I was just making stupid choices by running, I knew I was doing the right thing. I knew in my heart just how dangerous this man was, and that I, Ron, and our children would be at risk if he found us. So I guess I was surprised, but not surprised, the day I received the call from the prosecutor telling me that they had arrested my stepfather for a DUI, having a hit-and-run accident, and possession of a sawed-off shotgun, alongside a picture of myself and my last known addresses. But the surprises came when the prosecutor informed me that my stepfather had opted to plead out on our case, and the prosecutor had reduced the charge, and he was only sentenced to 2.5 years. Now, I would love to have taken the glory for his conviction, but I can't. I know that it was not me he was afraid to face in court again. No, he was afraid of facing my brother. At least I knew that he would go to jail and do some time, but the most important thing was that he was now tagged. And if he was ever accused of doing this again, everyone would believe the child. There would be no question that this is who he was. So the worst ending to this story was when I went to my mother's house that night, and I was crying when I said to her, "See, I told you I never lied." With my aunt and one of my mother's friends sitting at the table, my mother looked me right in the eyes and said, "I know, I've always known." And it was in that moment I had to make a quick decision, because I wanted to hurt her as badly as she had hurt me for so many years. But instead, I backed myself out of the door, and I knew in my heart that this was the beginning of the end of a relationship between her and I. That decision, though, to kick her out of my life took a long time, but once I realized I could not be near her without crying, it was time to let her go, and that's what I eventually did. I no longer believed that I had to chase her for her love. There are so many more parts of my life that I would love to be able to tell you, but there's just not enough time. I've been very fortunate in my life to have what I call living angels who have taught me so much. When I was trying to break up with my mother, one of them said to me, "I guess if you didn't get enough the first time, you're going to go back and get some more." But until someone said that to me, I didn't get it. Of the many lessons my two angels have taught me, The biggest one would be that I would never find love until I learned to love myself first, and that I could never expect anyone to believe in me if I couldn't believe in myself. They also said that the only person who could stop me from being better was me. Over the years, I've taken many trainings and workshops and courses on a huge variety of mental health and wellness subjects, and I have learned so much about myself that even sometimes I can't believe it. I know one of the greatest joys of my life, and this is going to sound stupid, but when I was diagnosed with complex PTSD, I was excited because this meant I was sick. I wasn't crazy. I think one of the biggest things I've learned is that I have to put the blame where it belongs. And once I started to do this, I think that's when the healing really started for me. And I've been a work in progress ever since, and I will continue to heal myself every day. It's been a lifetime of experiences to make me who I am today, and so it's not like it's just going to end. I have to watch me to make sure I'm okay. So I want to tell you about a workshop that I created that I call Unstuck Life After Trauma. I teach this workshop whenever I'm given an opportunity to do so. It's based on what I believe is the 4-step healing process. Those steps are see it, feel it, own it, and live on. So step 1 is to see it. And this is where I had to take a hard look at my early life. I had to see who it was that hurt me. I had to see my mother for who she really was, and for the things she did to me, and for the things she allowed other people to do to me, much of which came with no consequences to anyone but me. I had to see her as the hard, unloving person she truly was, and I had to learn to understand that she was never going to change. I also had to learn to believe that she was never going to love me or approve of me. I had to see my stepfather for who he really was and all the things he had done. I had to understand that he was never going to be anyone other than who he was. I had to understand that he was a vicious and cruel man and didn't care about the effect of what he did to anyone. I had to see him as a man who had no conscience and no sense of decency anywhere inside of him. I had to learn to see my siblings as having gone through so many of the same things that I did. And I had to understand that they were hurt too. I had to let go of any anger I felt towards them and try to learn to love them. And I had to learn to let go of the ones who couldn't accept me for the way I am now. This step was the hardest for me, and I think that's because I'd always taken the blame for everything. I was used to pain, so used, in fact, that I couldn't possibly cause pain for someone else. Now, I'm not a fool, because I'm aware I've hurt people in this world, but this is something I work very hard on trying not to hurt others. I had to see and own the fact that I never reached for help from anyone. I had to own and see the fact that I was not the best mother in the world, and although I always tried to be there for them, I do believe I failed in some aspects. I also believe that I failed myself. But I also have to see that it's never too late to change. And step 2 is feel it. So you have to learn how to feel it. Okay? I had to swallow my pain for so many years, and it actually came to a point where I didn't allow myself to feel it. I had to learn to feel the pain of my mother's cruelty. I had to allow myself to feel the pain at being a home abortion that lived just to be a huge inconvenience in my mother's life. I had to feel the pain that came with the knowledge of all the trauma that she had caused in my life. I had to feel the pain and disappointment of her inability to be a mother. I had to feel the pain of what my stepfather had done to me, and had to allow myself to feel disgust towards him. I had to allow myself to feel the pain of having an inability to love myself. I had to allow myself to feel the pain of letting my own kids down at times when they needed me most. I had to allow myself to feel the pain of living with thoughts of suicide for the majority of my life. Step 3 is owning it. And this is where I had to make the decisions of owning my memories, owning my feelings, and owning the right to create rules and boundaries in my life. I had to own the right to tell my mother, I'm done. To tell her that I could not and would not chase her for love or approval any longer. I had to own the right to choose to have her in my life or not, and not be guilted by someone else's story of what you have to do is you have to love your mother. And I have to own the right to stand up for myself to everyone, no matter who they are. I have to own the right to put myself first. I've had to learn to own the fact that my stepfather chose to hurt me and he deserved a prison sentence. And I own the right to express my disappointment with the prosecutor for not getting him a longer sentence. I've had to learn to own my rights, to tell anyone who hurt me to take a hike. I had to learn that I had the right to decide for myself what I would or would not tolerate from other people. I had to learn to own the right to stop being a people pleaser and to stop putting everyone else's needs before my own. I had to own the right to love myself and be proud of myself, and to understand that I was and I am a good person, and that I will not tolerate anyone who tries to make me feel any different. I've also had to own the right to make peace with the decisions and choices I've made before my healing journey began. I know that I was a product of the environment I was raised in, and I truly didn't know any better. But by looking at it like this, makes me unafraid to tell my story, to share my story, because it is what it is, and nothing that I can ever do will erase it. I also now own the right to stop judging myself, because all judgment from myself in the past has a very negative effect. I've had to own the right to create the boundaries that I need in place to keep myself healthy. And none of these boundaries are based on what other people want or say they need. And I own the right to provide consequences when people cross my boundaries. It is absolutely about me now, and I own that right also. And step 4 is live on. I've had to take the decision, rules, and boundaries that I've created and hold myself true to them. I've had to be able to do this without allowing anyone to make me feel bad or guilty. I have to be prepared to stand up for myself and not be swayed by anyone else. I have to understand who I once was and that I didn't want to go backwards in my healing process. To live on in a happy life, I had to forgive myself for the mistakes I've made in my life and own them, but more importantly, learn from them. I have to learn to live on and be the best version of myself that I can be. And I have to learn to live on in true happiness and contentment, understanding what that means to me. A lot of what I just talked about sounds pretty simple and easy, but trust me, it's not. I've been working my way through these steps for over 25 years, and sometimes it's really hard. I've spent a lifetime being open and honest with my spouse, myself, and my children, and I believe that's why my kids and I are able to work through our issues. I listen to them and truly hear what they're saying, and I'm not going to lie, sometimes it hurts and it's hard to hear, but it is what happened. But I also know that my children don't judge me. They truly understand me. I know that I'm not perfect, but every step forward we take, change can come. Making a change in your own life is hard, and you should never try to do it on your own. Just remember this, it's not going to happen overnight. It does take time. You will get what you put into it, nothing more and nothing less. Just know that asking for help is a sign of strength and not a weakness. And the last point that I want to make in my change is those cigarette burns on my chest. Yes, I see them, but I don't allow them to weaken me anymore. Today, when I'm feeling down or thinking that I can't go any further, I look at those scars and I allow them to empower me and to help push me forward. Thanks.